Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so I want you to imagine for a second that you're a structural engineer, but instead of steel and concrete, your building materials are information, data, and institutional claims. Pretty wild, right? Because we are constantly surrounded by this massive chasm of biased data, competing narratives, and totally subjective viewpoints. It's overwhelming. But today we're going to build a bridge of truth right over that chasm using something called the multilateral verification method. Let's dive in.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll start with the verification method, then move right into 3 steps to bypassing bias. After that, we'll look at 4 load-bearing systemic findings, and finally wrap up with tracing systemic resource flows.
All right, Section 1, the verification method. So here's the massive question staring us right in the face. How do we actually find truth across all this biased data? I mean, when you look at academic and structural analyses today, you are literally bombarded with conflicting datasets. Every organization has an angle. Every institution has its own perspective. So how can we possibly strip away that individual organizational bias to see how our systems are actually functioning behind the scenes? Well, the source material gives us a super specific tool to do exactly that.
That tool is called systemic cross-reference. It's defined as a rigorous process to validate structural diagnoses by bypassing individual organizational biases. The absolute key takeaway here is that this isn't just, reading between the lines. No, it's a highly structured methodology used to isolate objective reality from all those subjective claims. It basically forces us to stop looking at what an organization says it does and instead look at the verifiable architecture of what's actually happening on the ground.
Moving right along to Section 2, 3 steps to bypassing bias.
Okay, so here's how this works in practice. There are 3 distinct phases. Step 1 is simultaneous stress testing. This basically means subjecting every single claim to multiple divergent analytical frameworks at the exact same time. You aren't just testing a claim against friendly data, you're throwing it right into the fire of opposing frameworks. Think of it like testing a building's design against both earthquakes and hurricanes at the same time. Step 2 is structural validation. This is where you identify the findings that stay completely consistent even when viewed through those opposing lenses. If it survives the fire, it's structurally valid. And finally, step 3 is resource flow analysis. Once you actually know what's structurally valid, you map the systemic movement of actual assets and see the real-world impacts on different stakeholder groups.
All right, Section 3, 4 load-bearing systemic findings.
Now, notice the stark contrast we're looking at here. When you use this method, you're actively filtering out all that chaotic noise of opposing theories to find what the text calls load-bearing findings. These are the structural truths that persist across traditionally incompatible datasets. Because they survive that intense stress test, they become the absolute rock-solid foundation we can actually build our understanding on.
So what are they? The text identifies 4 massive, load-bearing systemic pillars that we're about to decode. We have organizational convergence, systemic allocation mechanics, institutional alignment, and platform distribution logic. Let's break these down one by one because, honestly, they are absolutely fascinating.
First up, organizational convergence. We often hold on to this illusion that private companies and public administrative bodies operate in totally separate spheres, right? Like they have completely different motivations. But the verified reality, observed across various time periods, shows a distinct trend where large-scale private entities and administrative bodies actually adopt very similar operational goals. The result? Highly integrated decision-making structures. They are functionally merging their objectives right behind the scenes.
Second, we have systemic allocation mechanics. This brilliantly illustrates the real rules of the game. The data shows that specific monetary arrangements, things like credit expansion and systemic distribution differences, serve as the primary engine for resource concentration. To translate that economic jargon for a second, the structural rules of how money is created and distributed naturally pull resources tightly to the center. It's basically a gravitational pull. This allocation mechanic perfectly explains why the rich often get richer during systemic shifts, totally regardless of what the intended policy was.
Third is institutional alignment. And wow, this one is a stark contrast to what we're normally told. Analysts across the spectrum actually agree on this. Foundational organizations, and this importantly includes educational and information-sharing bodies, often prioritize the interests of their primary funding sources over their stated public missions. Let that sink in. The institution will ultimately align with the money backing it, not the noble mission statement they print on their glossy brochures.
The fourth and final pillar is platform distribution logic. This one anchors right into our everyday lives. Operational data confirms that our digital information environments are architecturally designed to prioritize content that triggers high-intensity engagement and group-based responses. It is purely structural. Digital platforms are built to trap us in intense emotional engagement entirely by design, simply because that specific logic is what sustains the platform's infrastructure. It really is incredible to see just how deliberately these spaces are engineered.
Finally, let's jump to Section 4, tracing systemic resource flows.
By looking at systemic credit expansion, we can break down the actual flow of wealth to see exactly who wins and who ultimately absorbs the impact. The beneficiaries? They're the initial recipients of newly created liquidity. Essentially, they get their hands on the new money first. On the flip side, the impacted group consists of folks operating on fixed wages or people living in future economic cycles. The people whose wages don't immediately rise, well, they're the ones who absorb the invisible cost of that expansion.
Next, let's look at externalized obligations. When organizational structures are cleverly set up to distance liability, the benefits flow directly to the primary stakeholders. They get to keep all the upside, but what about the downside? Well, the impacted group here is the broader environment and public infrastructure. Basically, the public absorbs the associated costs and obligations that those primary stakeholders successfully externalized.
So we've built the lens together and we've surveyed the landscape. We've seen exactly how convergence, allocation, alignment, and digital platform logic shape our world, completely regardless of the PR spin organizations like to put out. So I want to leave you with one final, crucial thought. How are these verified systemic flows shaping your own organizational or digital environment right now? If you apply this unyielding, impartial, analytical lens to the institutions in your own everyday life, what load-bearing truths are you going to uncover? Start cross-referencing, start bypassing the bias, and keep investigating. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.